Hi guys! So in this video, I wanted to address one of the questions that I have been getting over Instagram from a few of you, and that is, how do you start unpacking a poem? And this is an especially relevant question when it comes to unseen poetry, because you're essentially given a text that you've never seen and asked to tackle it within a short period of time. And so it's necessary for you to have a strategy for this. And so one of my best tips is to look for patterns of repetition and also contrast. So really it's almost like a game of spotting similarities and differences. So when I talk about patterns of repetition, really we're looking at different kinds of repetition, and this doesn't necessarily have to be limited to words. Of course, on the most fundamental level, you have lexical repetition, and that would refer to words that recur throughout a text. So for example, if you see a word appearing time and time again, or if you see a word appearing for more than, say, 4 or 5 times, then you know that that's an important word in relation to the key message of the poem. Or if you see clusters of words that relate to the same idea or theme, then perhaps you've got yourself a certain kind of imagery. But of course, apart from lexical repetition, we also have syntactical repetition, sonic repetition, and structural repetition. So when it comes to syntactical repetition, that could be something like parallelism, or it could even be a more specific kind of parallelism, such as anaphora, which is the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of consecutive clauses or sentences, and perhaps the opposite of this, and that is epistrophe, right? Repetition of words or phrases at the end of lines, consecutive lines or clauses, etc. And actually, when it comes to sonic repetition, that really refers to your devices like alliteration, assonance, and consonance. And when it comes to something like structural repetition, for example, if you see a refrain in a poem, lines that repeat themselves in every single stanza, for example, or in a couple of the stanzas, then that's an example of a refrain, and obviously that's also worth commenting on. Oh, and by the way, when it comes to sonic repetition, you can kind of almost think of rhyme as an example of that as well, right? Because again, it's kind of repetition of similar sounds. So actually, when you start looking at it like that, you realize even just within the patterns of repetition and similarities, you've got a lot of points to talk about. Now, equally, it's important for us to be able to spot patterns of contrast in a text. So say, for example, if you spot 2 words that mean opposite things to each other, then that's probably a most basic case of contrast. And if you notice that these words are placed in a balanced way within the same line or clause or sentence, then perhaps that's an example of antithesis and juxtaposition. What's equally interesting is if we look at whether or not the combination of these opposite ideas make literal sense as a group. And so if you notice that there are 2 opposite ideas placed next to each other, but in that context they can't seem to coexist, or it's impossible for them to happen simultaneously, then perhaps that's an example of paradox. And so it's probably worth unpacking a little bit more to understand the source of that illogicality, which often always bears some sort of symbolic meaning. And of course, if that seeming paradox shows up as an adjective followed by a noun, then you've got yourself an oxymoron. And so contrast is very important because it's often the entry point to helping us identify the presence of irony in any given text. And equally, contrast usually symbolizes some sort of conflict or struggle, and that's always great for thematic discussion. And so there you have it, guys. 2 quick tips for you to get started with poetry analysis. And so number 1, spot patterns of repetition and similarities throughout a text. And number 2, spot patterns of contrast and differences. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.